In March 2023, Kentucky detectives finally identified the monster who brutally murdered 16-year-old Carol Sue Klaber in 1976. There was just one problem. Her killer had been dead for 32 years. How do you arrest a ghost? How do you serve justice to a man whose body has been rotting in the ground for over 3 decades? This isn't some supernatural thriller. This is the mind-bending reality of modern forensic science colliding with decades-old evil. For 47 years, Carol Sue's family lived in agonizing limbo. Every birthday without her, every Christmas morning with an empty chair at the table, every anniversary of that terrible June day when their beautiful, talented daughter was found beaten to death on a lonely Kentucky road. They waited for answers that seemed impossible to find. Think about your own family for just a moment. Could you survive nearly half a century without knowing who destroyed the person you loved most? Could you wake up every single day wondering if your child's killer was walking past you at the grocery store, sitting behind you at church, living right next door? The Klaber family endured this nightmare for 47 years. But here's what makes this case absolutely extraordinary. Carol Sue's killer thought he was untouchable. Back in 1976, DNA analysis was pure science fiction. Genetic genealogy didn't exist. Forensic databases were decades away. Thomas Dunaway committed what he believed was the perfect murder, then lived freely for 14 more years before dying of natural causes in 1990. He took his secrets to the grave, or so he thought, but science has a long memory. Technology doesn't forget. And in 2023, cutting-edge genetic genealogy reached back through time, across decades beyond death itself, to point its finger directly at a killer who thought he'd escaped forever. This is the story of how modern detectives solved an impossible case, identified a dead murderer, and finally brought closure to a family that had waited nearly half a century for justice. This is the story of Carol Sue Klaber and the scientific breakthrough that exposed her killer's name. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? I love connecting with viewers across different time zones. Drop a comment and let me know your location and local time. Are you watching this during your morning coffee in New York? Maybe it's late night in Tokyo. Or perhaps you're on lunch break in London. I'm genuinely curious about our global crime scene community. And here's another question that'll blow your mind. Have you ever heard of a case being solved decades after the killer died? Because what happened with Carol Sue's case defies everything we thought we knew about justice and time limits. If you're fascinated by cold cases that get solved against impossible odds, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where science and determination triumph over evil. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. June 5th, 1976. A Saturday morning that started like any other for a local dentist driving down Chambers Road in Walton, Kentucky. This remote stretch of asphalt cut through farmland and forest, the kind of quiet country road where you might see more deer than cars on any given day. It was peaceful, isolated, exactly the kind of place where someone could dispose of evidence without being seen. But as the dentist rounded a bend, something caught his eye in the roadside ditch. Something that didn't belong in this serene landscape, something that would shatter the innocence of this small Kentucky community forever. There, discarded like trash among the weeds and debris, lay the lifeless body of 16-year-old Carol Sue Klaber. The scene that confronted first responders was a testament to savage violence. Carol Sue had suffered massive blunt force trauma to her skull, wounds consistent with being beaten repeatedly with a tire iron. Ligature marks encircled her neck, evidence of strangulation. The medical examiner would later confirm she had also been sexually assaulted before her murder. This wasn't a crime of passion that got out of hand. This was calculated brutality. Someone had used Carol Sue for their twisted desires, then systematically destroyed her with a weapon of opportunity before dumping her body on this lonely road. The killer had shown her no mercy, no humanity, just pure, unfettered evil. But here's what makes this case absolutely extraordinary. While that monster was beating Carol Sue to death, he was unknowingly sealing his own fate. Every act of violence left behind microscopic evidence, biological material that would preserve his identity for decades. In 1976, that DNA was just wet evidence in a rape kit, meaningless biological matter that investigators carefully collected and stored but couldn't decode. The technology to read genetic fingerprints wouldn't exist for another decade. DNA profiling was still trapped in the realm of theoretical science, so that crucial evidence sat in an evidence locker, waiting patiently for the world to catch up. The killer had left his genetic signature at the crime scene, never dreaming that science would someday reach back through time to expose him. He drove away from Chambers Road that morning, believing he'd committed the perfect murder. After all, it was 1976. Forensic genealogy was unimaginable. DNA databases didn't exist. He was untouchable. Carol Sue's body told a story of unthinkable violence, but it also held the key to her killer's eventual identification. That evidence would wait 47 years for technology to evolve enough to speak her killer's name. Carol Sue Klaber was far more than a name in a police file or a statistic in Kentucky's unsolved murder database. She was a vibrant 16-year-old with calloused fingertips from hours of guitar practice and a heart that drew her to help others in her Fort Wright community. Music flowed through Carol Sue's soul. She played both guitar and violin with the kind of passion that made people stop and listen when she performed. Her friends at Dixie Heights High School remembered her infectious enthusiasm for every song she learned, every melody she mastered. She wasn't just playing music, she was living it, breathing it, planning a future where her talents could touch the world. But the Klaber family had already weathered devastating loss. In 1970, when Carol Sue was just 10 years old, her father died, leaving their mother to raise 3 children alone. That tragedy could have torn the family apart, but instead it forged unbreakable bonds between Carol Sue and her 2 older brothers. They became each other's strength, their mother's support system, proof that love could survive even the deepest grief. Carol Sue channeled her empathy into volunteer work throughout Fort Wright. She understood pain, understood loss, and she wanted to ease that burden for others. Her genuine kindness wasn't performative. It came from a place of authentic compassion, the kind that can only be born from surviving your own darkness. At 16, Carol Sue's future stretched before her like an open highway. College applications were on the horizon. Music scholarships beckoned. She talked about using her talents to make a difference, maybe becoming a music therapist or teacher. Her dreams weren't just about personal success. They were about lifting others up through the healing power of music. She was a daughter who'd helped her family survive tragedy, a sister who'd grown closer to her brothers through shared resilience, a young woman whose music and volunteer spirit touched everyone around her. But on June 4th, 1976, all of those dreams, all of that potential, all of that beautiful music still waiting to be created would be silenced forever. June 4th, 1976 began as an ordinary Friday for Carol Sue Klaber, the kind of day that starts with no warning of the horror waiting at its end. That afternoon, she left her family's home in Fort Wright, but not before dropping off her bicycle, a detail that would later seem ominous to investigators. Why would a teenager who regularly rode her bike everywhere suddenly leave it behind? The answer was simple and terrifying. Carol Sue knew she was getting a ride somewhere. Witnesses reported seeing the 16-year-old getting into a car that matched one of 2 descriptions, either a Chevrolet Monte Carlo or a Pontiac Grand Prix. The vehicle was driven by a man with sandy blonde hair, someone who appeared comfortable enough with Carol Sue that she willingly got into his car. This wasn't a stranger abduction. This was someone she trusted. But the most disturbing piece of the puzzle came from other witnesses who'd seen Carol Sue at DeVoe Park in the days before her disappearance. She'd been spotted talking with a man who perfectly matched the driver's description: sandy blonde hair, the right age, seemingly friendly and approachable. Was this predator carefully building trust with his victim? Was he grooming Carol Sue, studying her routines, learning when and where she'd be vulnerable? The conversation at DeVoe Park, the decision to get into that car, these final choices would haunt investigators for decades. What did he say to convince her? How did he gain her trust? These questions would never receive answers because within hours of getting into that vehicle, Carol Sue's life ended in unthinkable violence. somewhere between Fort Wright and that desolate stretch of Chambers Road in neighboring Boone County. Her killer sexually assaulted her, beat her savagely with a tire iron, and strangled her. Then he dumped her body like refuse before driving away into the night. Her killer believed he'd committed the perfect crime. After all, it was 1976. DNA analysis existed only in science fiction novels. Forensic genealogy was decades from invention. Computer databases were primitive at best. He'd left biological evidence at the scene, but that evidence might as well have been invisible. Technology couldn't read genetic fingerprints. Science couldn't reach across time. He was completely safe from consequences. At least, that's what he thought. Detective Jerry Keith of the Kentucky State Police took ownership of Carol Sue's case with the determination of a man who understood that every unsolved murder represented a family's shattered world. For nearly a decade, Keith pursued every lead, interviewed every potential witness, and followed every thread that might connect to Carol Sue's killer. The evidence Keith collected was substantial by 1976 standards. He had DNA from the rape kit, though it was just biological material sitting in storage, waiting for technology that wouldn't exist for another decade. He had fingerprints from the crime scene, but they led nowhere because the killer wasn't in any database. He had detailed witness descriptions of both the suspect and the vehicle, but those descriptions matched thousands of men driving similar cars throughout Kentucky. Keith identified potential suspects who seemed promising. One man had stolen a vehicle matching the witness descriptions in northern Indiana. Another individual had committed a rape in a nearby community in October 1978, using similar methods to Carol Sue's attacker. But without DNA technology to definitively link these suspects to the crime scene evidence, Keith hit wall after wall. This was the maddening reality of 1970s criminal investigation, having crucial evidence but lacking the scientific tools to unlock its secrets. Keith knew Carol Sue's killer had left his genetic signature at the scene. He knew those fingerprints belonged to the murderer. He knew the witness descriptions were accurate, but knowing and proving are two completely different things in a courtroom. Keith carried Carol Sue's case with him into retirement, never forgetting her face from the crime scene photos, never stopping the mental investigation that played out in his mind for years. Even decades later, he could recite every detail of the case from memory. The failure to solve it wasn't from lack of effort. It was from the limitations of forensic science in the pre-DNA era. Keith knew Carol Sue's killer was out there somewhere, walking free, potentially killing again. And as it would later be revealed, he was absolutely right. Can you imagine being an investigator like Detective Keith, having all this evidence but no way to use it? You've got the killer's DNA, his fingerprints, detailed witness descriptions, everything you need to solve the case, but the technology simply doesn't exist to connect those dots. Let me know in the comments how you think you'd handle that level of frustration. Would you be able to move on to other cases, or would it consume you the way it did Keith? I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts because this kind of technological limitation seems impossible to us now, but it was the harsh reality for investigators just a few decades ago. If you're finding this case as fascinating as I am, smash that like button to help other true crime fans discover these incredible stories. And don't forget to subscribe to Crime Scene for more cold cases where persistence and science eventually triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Because this story is about to take an even more shocking turn. What investigators didn't know, couldn't have known in 1976, was that Carol Sue's murderer was hiding in plain sight, his violence escalating even as her case grew cold. Thomas W. Dunaway was 19 years old in June 1976, living in Park Hills, Kentucky, barely half a mile from DeVoe Park, where Carol Sue had been seen talking with that mysterious sandy-haired man. The parallels were perfect, almost mockingly so. Dunaway drove a vehicle that matched witness descriptions. He had sandy blonde hair. He lived within walking distance of where Carol Sue was last seen alive. He was the right age, the right build, in the right place, at the right time. He was the man in the park, the man who'd gained her trust, the man who'd convinced her to get into his car. But here's the most calculated and terrifying detail. After murdering Carol Sue on June 4th, 1976, Thomas Dunaway did something that reveals the calculating mind of a killer trying to cover his tracks. On June 7, 1976, the Kentucky Post published a newspaper article describing the suspect and vehicle description in Carol Sue's case. Just 1 week later, on June 14th, Dunaway was signing his United States Army enlistment papers. The timing wasn't coincidental. This was a desperate attempt to establish an alibi, to flee the jurisdiction, to escape the mounting pressure of a murder investigation. Dunaway's military service would be short-lived and violent, ending when he went AWOL to continue his reign of terror. On a December night in 1976, just 6 months after brutally murdering Carol Sue, Thomas Dunaway shot and killed Ronald "Ronnie" Townsend. Another life stolen by this monster, another family destroyed. But when Dunaway was finally caught and prosecuted for Townsend's murder, the justice system failed spectacularly. 7 years. That's all Dunaway served for taking a human life. 7 years for murder, while Carol Sue's case remained unsolved and her killer's identity stayed protected by the limitations of 1970s forensic science. In 1984, this violent predator walked free, released back into society after serving a fraction of what he deserved. Dunaway's criminal record continued to expand. Arson, illegal firearm possession, a pattern of violence that painted the picture of a man who had no regard for human life or the law. He was a walking time bomb, a repeat offender whose light sentences enabled him to continue terrorizing communities. In 1990, at age 33, Thomas Dunaway died of a heart attack, taking his secrets with him to the grave. He'd lived free for 14 years after murdering Carol Sue, committed additional violent crimes, and died believing his first murder would remain forever unsolved. For 32 years, it seemed like Dunaway had achieved the impossible. He'd literally taken his secrets to the grave. Death appeared to be his final victory, his ultimate escape from justice. At least, that's what everyone believed. For Carol Sue's family, the years crawled by with agonizing slowness. Her mother lived with the unbearable pain that only comes from losing a child to violence, a pain compounded by the torturous absence of answers. Every morning brought the same questions. Who did this? Why Carol Sue? Are they still out there? Her brothers carried a different kind of burden, survivor's guilt mixed with helpless rage. They'd already lost their father in 1970, then watched their sister's life get stolen in 1976. The family had been decimated by tragedy, but the cruelest twist was not knowing who had destroyed their world. They'd buried Carol Sue without ever learning her killer's name. The Klaber family watched from the sidelines as forensic science exploded into the modern age. DNA profiling emerged in the 1980s. Criminal databases expanded throughout the 1990s. Cold cases across the country suddenly started getting solved as technology advanced. And with each breakthrough, they wondered, when would it be their turn? Would Carol Sue's case ever see justice? Detective Jerry Keith wondered the same thing. Even in retirement, he couldn't release his grip on Carol Sue's case. He dedicated nearly a decade of his career to finding her killer, interviewing suspects, chasing leads, building a case file thick enough to choke a horse. But none of it had been enough. The failure haunted Keith not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he'd done everything right with the tools available in the 1970s. Those tools simply weren't sufficient to catch a killer who'd left biological evidence, but lived in an era before that evidence could speak. Carol Sue's murder cast a shadow over everyone it touched. Family, friends, investigators, all carrying the weight of unfinished business for decades. In 2017, the Boone County Sheriff's Office made a decision that would change everything. They established a dedicated cold case unit. Detectives Coy Cox and Tim Adams were assigned to breathe new life into the county's most stubborn, unsolved mysteries. And Carol Sue Klaber's murder topped their priority list. Cox and Adams' first move was brilliant. They reached out to Jerry Keith, the original investigator who'd never truly let go of the case. Despite being long retired, Keith's memory remained sharp as a razor. He could recite every detail from 40 years earlier. Witness statements, evidence locations, suspect descriptions, investigative dead ends. Keith had carried Carol Sue's case in his mind for decades, and now he had a chance to pass that torch to a new generation of detectives. Keith shared his two primary suspects with Cox and Adams, The first was the man who'd stolen a vehicle matching witness descriptions in northern Indiana. Cox and Adams tracked him down, and remarkably, the man agreed to provide a DNA sample. His cooperation was notable. He readily admitted to a lifetime of criminal activity, but adamantly denied killing Carol Sue. The DNA test proved his honesty. He was eliminated as a suspect. Next came Michael Dean Tate, the man who'd committed a rape in a nearby community in October 1978. The similarities to Carol Sue's case were striking. Tate targeted young women, used violence, and had been in the area during the relevant time frame. In 2020, Cox and Adams identified Tate through fingerprints found on his 1978 victim's car, the same victim who'd narrowly escaped Carol Sue's fate by talking Tate into releasing her. Tate confessed to the 1978 rape but denied any involvement in Carol Sue's murder. When his DNA was compared to evidence from the crime scene, there was no match. After 45 years of investigation, Cox and Adams were back at square one. Carol Sue's case seemed cursed to remain unsolved forever, another victim of time and limited forensic capabilities. In September 2022, Cox and Adams made a decision born from equal parts desperation and hope. They contacted Othram Inc., a cutting-edge genetic genealogy company in Houston, Texas, that specialized in solving cold cases through revolutionary DNA analysis. Season of Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding cold case investigations, agreed to finance the testing. What happened next represented the absolute pinnacle of forensic science. Othram scientists employed forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive DNA profile from the degraded biological evidence collected in 1976. This wasn't your standard DNA test. This was genetic archaeology, extracting readable data from biological material that had been sitting in evidence storage for nearly half a century. The process was mind-bending in its complexity. Othram's in-house genealogy team took that DNA profile and compared it against massive public genealogy databases, the same ones people use to trace their family histories and find long-lost relatives. They built family trees stretching back generations, identifying potential relatives of the unknown suspect, then worked forward through time to narrow down possible candidates. In less than 2 months, Cox and Adams received a phone call that seemed impossible. The voice on the other end delivered 7 words that would change everything. "We believe this is your guy." The name was Thomas W. Dunaway. Cox and Adams stared at each other in stunned silence. They'd never heard that name before. It wasn't on Jerry Keith's suspect list. It hadn't appeared in any of their previous investigations. But when they researched Thomas Dunaway, the pieces fell into place with terrifying precision. Then came the detail that made their blood run cold. Thomas W. Dunaway had been dead since 1990, dead for 32 years. They'd identified Carol Sue's killer 3 decades too late to arrest him, but science demanded confirmation. Cox and Adams tracked down a living relative of Dunaway and obtained a DNA sample for direct comparison. The lab results arrived with mathematical certainty that left no room for doubt. "This is a 100% match," the report stated. "Parent-child match." Thomas W. Dunaway had murdered Carol Sue Klaber on June 4, 1976. The evidence was irrefutable. The case was solved. After 46 years of mystery, 46 years of anguish, 46 years of unanswered questions, genetic genealogy had reached across nearly 5 decades to expose a killer who thought he'd escaped justice forever. Science had accomplished what seemed impossible. It had identified a dead murderer and finally given Carol Sue's family the answers they'd waited a lifetime to hear. Detective Coy Cox would later describe the moment he told Carol Sue's brother that her killer had been identified as one of the most emotional experiences of his career. After 46 years of waiting, of wondering, of living with the weight of unsolved tragedy, the family was finally about to receive the answers they'd prayed for. Cox met with Carol Sue's brother and delivered the news that seemed impossible. They knew who had murdered his sister. The killer's name was Thomas W. Dunaway. The evidence was definitive. The case was solved. Physically, you could see him, just the relief, Cox recalled, his voice breaking with emotion. I mean, just the air just kind of left his body. And then he made the audible statement that, "I have closure." Closure. After 46 years of torment, the Klaber family could finally begin to heal. They couldn't prosecute Dunaway. Death had granted him that final escape, but they knew who had taken Carol Sue from them. They knew his name, his face, his history of violence. The faceless monster that had haunted their dreams for decades now had an identity. Boone County Commonwealth's attorney Lewis Kelly officially declared the case closed, bringing procedural finality to nearly half a century of investigation. But Cox wasn't finished. He obtained a court order to exhume Dunaway's body and collect a direct DNA sample for entry into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. If Dunaway had committed other crimes, and given his documented pattern of violence, it seemed likely his DNA profile would now be available to match against evidence from unsolved cases across the country. Justice had arrived 46 years late, but it had arrived nonetheless. Carol Sue Klaber could finally rest in peace. What do you think about genetic genealogy solving decades-old cases like this one? On one hand, it's incredible that science can reach back through time to identify killers who thought they'd escaped forever. But on the other hand, should there be limits on how this technology is used? Are there privacy concerns we should consider? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this is a conversation our society needs to have. If this story amazed you as much as it did me, please share this video with someone who loves true crime. Spreading awareness about these cold case breakthroughs gives hope to families still waiting for answers about their loved ones. And if you want more stories where cutting-edge science meets decades-old mysteries, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. The Crime Scene channel is dedicated to cases where persistence and technology finally triumph over evil, no matter how much time has passed. Because justice delayed doesn't always mean justice denied.